Greetings. You might be interested to know how exactly does XianYun's work so that you can understand how to implement her mechanics into your team rotations. And there's a few lists of doubts that I've tried to do some testing and I got some answer with that. So perhaps you might be interested to know how does it go. When we look into her skill, it's either you use one stack or you use full stacks. And the difference between them is really just damage. Other than that, that is essentially it. I'm sure you're more interested to know how does a buff work for you. So there are three things to discuss right here. First, how does her extra animal damage can assist you? Second, how does a buff work in general? Then lastly, how does her extra damage works towards a specific target against multiple instances? And starting with the additional damage that she can deal. On paper, it does nothing. It has low damage overall, but it can help you to extend elemental aura, especially if you are focused on playing weak reactions such as Pyro Vaporize or Cryo Melt. Do note that is a catch. For instance, if you apply too much elemental aura, by the time you are able to plunge, you will be removing the underlying hydro aura needed for XianYun to throw that element. Granted, this does mean that you need to change your strategy to include a character that is capable of applying high rates of hydro aura in this instance. With that, it's time to move on to how does a buff work. Earlier, we did emphasize on amplification reactions. In case you're wondering if her flat damage buff is a separate instance from her damage phase, so I did some tests and it turns out that her damage does get amplified together with the plunge attack. So it is to your best interest to try your best to vaporize or melt your plunge attack for maximum output. Also, if you're trying to use Bennett or Sarah's buff to buff her damage boost, then you don't have to worry about that. Her buff work dynamically, and the buff duration for both Bennett and Sarah isn't too long enough to make it worth it. Instead, she prefers attack buffers that have a long duration, such as Yoimiya, Chevreuse, artifact set like Noblesse, and Tenacity artifact set. Unless of course you try to play her as an on-field DPS, then by all means that is a good strategy. And after you use all 8 instances of the plunge attack bonus, you will stop receiving the jump buff. And to me, this is the only grievance I have about this mechanic. They could have just kept the jump buff all the way for the whole burst duration and take away the extra bonus, and it will still be a fun experience, I suppose. Probably to let you know that the extra bonus isn't active so that you can see the effect for yourself, and perhaps it can allow the player to recognize that the buff isn't active so that they wouldn't be confused that their damage isn't as high as it could be with XianYun's buff. Though I'm not too sure if this could apply to plunge attack specialists like Xiao and Gaming. Both of them have their own skill uptime and they would not be affected by this consideration. Otherwise, the last thing to touch on is how does her additional damage work for a group of enemies? We know that the extra boost only works for one target, and her buff will be applied to the target that is hit by the animation first. But it can be hard to tell at times. So when you're targeting a tight groups of opponents, forget about target prioritization, and with that, that is everything about her burst. Now, what's left is her burst interaction with different characters. Let's start with Raiden Shogun. I think one of the most interesting question is whether or not does XianYun's buff work on her. So to find that out, I performed a simple test with Zhongli. I start out his pillar and you can see what's the base damage versus with XianYun's buff. And XianYun's buff doesn't work on Raiden's burst, which is unfortunate, but it is clearly stated into the description that it is considered as a burst damage. As a result, it's not considered as a plunge attack for it to work. So this means that for any other character that doesn't have this description with their mechanics, you can safely assume that they will be able to receive XianYun's buff as long as they are doing their plunge attack. And that's about it. Of course, the next character is slightly interesting in the sense that Dehya herself does have a unique mechanics that requires you to perform jump cancel to cut short her burst duration. And with XianYun's buff, it is still doable. And I know it's not worth putting these two characters together, but it is an interesting mechanic that is worth discussing irregardless. And the last character that I want to discuss is going to be Eula. And I know she's not the best character to play along with XianYun. If you want to use a buff for damage as well as trying to stack her burst damage, well, she can still work if you want to play her in two different phases. Like say the first phase is trying to build up her burst. Typical normal attack spamming gameplay, then after the burst pops off, you then activate XianYun's buff and play Eula as an plunge attack DPS. In this way, this gameplay allows you to play Eula at almost 100% uptime, and it does depend on your electro character to maintain super conduct for her to enjoy the full extent of her rotation. Granted, this is something that I've come up with. My Eula account doesn't have XianYun to test them out together and see if the experience is somewhat enjoyable in the first place. But if you do own them both, do give it a try and see how does the gameplay feels like. And with that, that is essentially all the characters that I want to touch on. So I do want to close off with discussing how does her energy recharge requirements work. I know the numbers has been revealed. It's about 150 all the way to possibly 200 plus ER. And depending on your weapons, the conditions can be more favorable to you. And of course, team comms matters. So I'm just going to highlight what do you do with low energy recharge build versus high ER build? And it all's going to boil down with your gameplay preference. If you're used to playing support with a single skill usage and end off with their bursts, then you will have to build XianYun with a high ER build. And as mentioned earlier, depending on the team comms and weapons options, you get to reduce the energy requirements quite a fair bit. And I think you know that this is an old news. You are pretty familiar with that concept. So what do I do with like a low ER requirements? You have to use a skill twice. Yes, it doesn't sound like a mind-boggling revelation, but for XianYun, you have to consider the 12-second cooldown being rather detrimental to your gameplay rotation. Just rotating through your allies is not gonna be enough time to pass that 12-second cooldown. So you will have to extend your rotation a little bit. And to be honest, doing this is not going to impact your performance too ridiculously. After all, the last thing that you want is for this cooldown to affect your main DPS from enjoying your team's buff to its full benefits. And that's the consideration you do have to take care of while trying to play at lower energy recharge. After all, RNG for artifacts has never been your friend, and the best thing we can do with it is to make up with gameplay. I do have to caution you that this isn't gonna be a perfect solution for every single scenario. For instance, equipment itself will change how XianYun is gonna rotate within your party members. Veritas set and the Tales of the Dragon Slayer will constrict your gameplay rotation with your main DPS. So unfortunately, this is gonna be something that you will have to playtest and consider the rotation. Other than that, hopefully you have gained something from this video. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of the day and goodbye.